Welcome to The Finance Files, a podcast hosted by best friends Brittany Carter and Whitney Kofford, with occasional appearances by my dad, Greg Kofford, and other guests.
We'll talk about all things finance, including investing, trading, economics, capital markets, and business management. Learn the investor mindset with us.
So here's our legal disclaimer. This podcast is not investment advice. It's purely for entertainment purposes, at least we hope. Here's your first lesson in finance. Don't accept everything you hear or read, especially if it comes from the internet, which is where you're probably hearing or watching us. All materials are the individual's own opinions and do not necessarily represent the views of any other entities or persons that may be mentioned. If we talk positively about a stock, assume we own that stock and are selling after this podcast is released. If we talk negatively about a stock, assume we've shorted that stock and are covering our short as soon as this podcast is released. Make your investment decisions accordingly. Thank you.
We're your hosts. I'm Brit.
And I'm Whit, and we're here with my dad, the Greg Kofford.
So before we dive in, this is the first podcast. You probably want to know who we are, why you should probably listen to us, and what you'll get out of this podcast.
I'll start off since this was kind of my brainchild for a while. I wanted to start this podcast to encourage people to start developing the investor mindset and thinking like an investor. So to that end, the way we're going to structure this is each weekday we're going to release a short episode, 10 to 20 minutes long, and each episode within a week will relate back to a theme. So for example, this week the theme is, why should you learn to think like an investor? For Monday, we're going to start with a Market Monday and talk about how the theme is relevant in the current market and why it matters to you as an average individual.
Then Tuesday, we'll dive into the topic with more details so you really get a grasp of the subject. And these aren't going to be just like some weird abstract topics. The idea is we want to make them really start with the basics, especially in these first few episodes, and make sure that we're actually teaching things that you can apply to your everyday life. So we'll cover that on Tuesday. And then I'm super excited for Wednesday, just as a history nerd. It is applicable because history repeats itself, but we'll basically look at how has this topic played out throughout history, right? Like, how did this happen before so we can better predict how it might happen in the future.
And then on Thursdays, we'll talk about how you can think about the topic like an investor. What is the investor mindset in relation to this particular topic? And then we'll wrap it up on Fridays with a Fundamental Friday. So talk about some of the basics. We'll give an action item or some homework or some suggestions on what you can work on over the weekend and in the coming week to apply the investor mindset and this topic to your own life.
I think that's what I was most excited about with this podcast is there's a lot of podcasts you can just passively listen to, but we wanted one to make sure that everything we're covering is super pertinent to your life. Like, even if you think that you're not going to invest money, understanding how to think like an investor and understand the world from the investor lens is so valuable. And then also just having action items. So we're going to really make sure that whatever resources or worksheets we give you on Friday are helping you improve your life, not just passively listening to learn more about finance.
Exactly. So let's get started.
So normally on Market Mondays, we're going to talk about current events in the market, but we figured we might want to start off telling you a little bit about who we are. So Whitney, since you are the mastermind behind the Finance Files, and the reason why we're all here, would love for you to start.
Yeah, so my background, I'll start with that. I actually started my career working at a large nonprofit performing arts center, so literally nothing to do with investing. And I worked there for about 8 years, got my MBA, and during my MBA, I just loved my finance and economics classes, which is a surprise because historically I did not like economics. But it just, the way the professor presented it was so interesting. And so at the time I went to my dad, a very seasoned investor, and I asked him, hey, will you hire me? I want to learn about investing. And so I've been working with him for about 4 years now. And the impetus for this podcast basically was I've learned so much from him in the past 4 years that I want other people to have the advantage of his insights and his advice to investing and how to think like an investor. And so that's kind of my goal with the podcast, is just get the Greg Kofford out there for the world to be able to learn from him, because I've learned a lot. And then tied in with that, another kind of sub goal of mine with this podcast is basically I want women to feel like they can be investors, because very often I am the only female investor in the room or at conferences, and ladies, we can't leave the investing to the men. So that's why Brittany's here, because I want to foster and encourage women to invest. And so, Britt, I'll let you introduce yourself and your background.
So you would think my investment journey would have started earlier in life. I grew up with a serial tech entrepreneur as a father. I got a degree in business with an emphasis in entrepreneurship. So I've been really well versed in a lot of the early stage investing, helping startups invest. I also worked as an analyst for 3 years, covering over 70 different industries. And I was quoted in, every publication you can think of, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. But funnily enough, I wasn't taking my own advice and investing in some of these companies. So I definitely think that's something I had to learn over time. And I'm super excited for this podcast, because I just think I wish someone had given me these tools and made sure that I was actually applying. I had a lot of the pieces, but figuring out how to apply it to my own life and how to make my money work for me.
And then just to make sure we have a really well-rounded points of view, we do have the white hair in the room, and are going to really appreciate learning from him. So, Dad, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Greg. My career started with family offices. I've worked for
Pause.
several.
What is a family office?
Well, a family office is an office that's set up to manage the wealth of a family or an individual that can afford to have their own personal investment office.
Okay.
So I did that for several members of the Forbes 400 list before striking out on my own. Set up my first investment partnership about 30 years ago. And recently, just before the pandemic, set up Sorby Bornholm, which is the investment vehicle that we use today to make the investments.
Okay. So, as the seasoned investor here, what are you thinking about on this Market Monday?
Well, the kind of the two things that stand out to me right now are, one, the rate reduction that the Federal Reserve has been going through. They dropped rates 50 basis points recently. There's speculation that next month they'll drop some more, and there
Okay.
was.
Why
Pardon?
does that matter for an investor?
Well, it matters because interest rate is the cost of money. In other words, it's what you pay to have access to money. And that's important for individuals as well as businesses. Obviously, most people are impacted by the cost of a mortgage or the cost of automobile financing. And as rates have come down, mortgage rates have come down, and the cost of automobile financing has come down. But for companies, their cost to access borrowed money has come down as well. And so that makes it more profitable for their investments, or it might cause them to take on additional risk on a project that they might have otherwise passed on because the cost of money was too high. And so the lower the cost of capital, the more, should we say, entrepreneurial spirit exists in companies even, because it's cheaper to get the money to do things. And so with the Federal Reserve reducing rates, that's been a focus, but they clearly have a ways to go on reducing rates.
Okay, so the reason that inflation matters to the average individual is going to have to do with if you're purchasing a car or a home. For businesses, it is particularly relevant, especially if you're looking to borrow money, because that's going to impact what the interest rate is.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So So basically, interest and what the Fed is doing affects everyone, is the moral of the story, right?
Yes.
So everyone needs to develop an investor mindset. Hint, hint, listen to this podcast. Okay, so what else are you thinking about?
So besides, with the recent information that's come out about employment numbers, which look pretty strong, that's raised a question as to how fast the Fed will reduce rates, because the reason they originally raised rates was to try to dampen inflation. And the stronger the labor market, the harder it is to reduce interest rates, because inflation is hard to put down when there's strong employment, if that makes
Okay,
sense.
pause. See, this is why economics to me is so confusing. And Britt, like, tell me if you agree, but like, my eyes have already glazed over.
So think about it this way, okay? So you're in a large family. If everybody has a job, then everybody's happy and everybody buys whatever they want. Okay? And so if there's only one of something that everybody wants, then the price of that gets pushed up because everybody has money. And so that causes inflation. If within that family, one or two people are unemployed, then it's less likely that you're going to have as aggressive inflation, because there's fewer people that have money to spend, let alone are going to be trying to drive the value of that item up. And so that's why the labor market matters, is if everybody's employed and if everybody's making money, then you have a lot of people that are going to spend that money rather than save that money. And so inflation comes about when you have more money chasing less goods and services than are available. And so people are willing to pay more for that.
I'm curious too, though, because we have seen a lot of layoffs. Like, how how is it that we're seeing strong employment yet like so many layoffs? Is that just a lower labor force participation rate, or well, what I've heard is that actually like the reason why and this is going off of the employment discussion, but the part of the reason why the stock market is so strong right now is not actually indicative of the market as a whole. It's because the FANG companies have done so many layoffs that they've drastically improved their OpEx and are just like blasting the market because they're such a great portion of the market. So I'm curious, like, do you agree with that? Or like, I don't know if I have a clear idea of like, just because from personal experience, like I have so
Sure.
many friends that are getting laid off. I have so many friends looking for jobs. So it's funny to hear this and wonder like what's actually happening, right?
Well, sure. The thing I think that's going on, remember, when people get laid off, most people don't then just go home and watch TV for the rest of their life.
Wouldn't
They
that be
look
great?
for another job. All right. I had a son who was laid off a couple of months ago, and he's now gainfully employed again. And the company he worked for just was trying to reduce expenses, and he was one of the low men on the totem pole in terms of seniority, and that's why he got the axe. But he had valuable skills. He had a number of companies interested in him, and that made it possible for him to get reemployed again. And I think that's the experience of most people. I don't think there's a desperate experience in the marketplace right now of people saying, "Oh, how do I get a job? What do I get a job?" I think what you're experiencing probably with most of your friends is, it's not that they can't get a job, they are unable to get the perfect job at this moment. But if they were willing to, take that, second tier job, there's hundreds that they could be employed at tomorrow. And so it's people holding out for the top tier job that I think are usually having the slight struggle right now. And so I think, and the numbers are showing the employment market is robust.
Interesting. And just so I'm clear, so the reason that employment affects inflation, correct? So if unemployment is low, then inflation is going to have to be, it can be a little higher because there's more people spending more money. Do I have that correct?
Well, inflation is simply prices increasing. Okay. To get inflation down, it's harder when there is full employment.
Got it.
Because it's harder to make prices go down. But full employment doesn't necessarily make inflation.
So for the average individual, why should I pay attention to unemployment?
Well, like I said, the unemployment right now is going to impact the Fed's thinking about when they're going to reduce interest rates. At the end of the day, the average person is only going to care about the interest rate, but the unemployment is a factor that drives that.
Are there countries where you like don't have a governing force impacting the interest rate, and how does that impact the economics there, right? Like, because we're basically the puppets of the Fed a little bit, right? Am I right? Or
next you're going to want me to bring up when I was invited to join the Illuminati and was too stupid to accept it, right?
What? Wow. Spoiler alert. Maybe that needs to be a future episode.
No, we're not puppets of the Fed. If you don't like it here, you could move to Australia, you could move to Canada, you could move to Western Europe and enjoy basically the same lifestyle, the same type of people, the same, general culture. So we're not puppets of the Fed by any
well, but they're dictating the interest rates.
Well, they have a choice on their interest rate, but they don't necessarily dictate the interest rate. Because remember, they have to sell trillions of dollars worth of bonds every year. And if they price those bonds too high, they don't sell them. So the market and the Fed kind of do a constant dance.
As an investor, let's just say, like, I'm just focused on my retirement account, set it and forget it. How does inflation and unemployment factor into that? Like, is there anything I need to take into account as inflation changes over the years?
Well, obviously, when inflation is high, that degrades the quality of your investments. In other words, if you own a bunch of bonds paying 3% interest and inflation is 8% a year, your future spending ability is declining. It's not increasing. And so your odds of being able to retire are going down, not up. And so you need to be cognizant of what is happening with inflation and how your investment choices are impacted by that.
So as an investor, or even if I'm not necessarily managing a portfolio day to day, I should still pay attention to inflation, because it's going to impact any sort of investment that I have, whether that's retirement, stocks, bonds. It'll also impact
it's going to make you're going to wake up to it every time you go to the grocery store or the mall or you buy gas, because everything's going to be more expensive.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say.
Right.
So, and it directly, immediately impacts my spending power.
Yeah.
All right, so today we covered inflation, we covered unemployment, we talked about why that matters for the average investor, average individual, why investors think about those two things, and we definitely will need to do a deeper dive into both in coming weeks. But since that's all we have time for today, we'll wrap it up. Join us tomorrow for Topic Tuesday, where we talk a little bit more about investing and why you should become an investor.